Hello and welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Great to have you here for a show. Anyway, if you have tuned in for the first time, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor and I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've written some books. I've done some other things. My most recent book is In the House of Tom Bombadil. Enough about me. How about you, Tom?
I'm Tom Price. I'm a teacher. I teach theology, ethics, and philosophy. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
And I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I am a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, professor emeritus of history at Central Connecticut State University, and among the walking wounded.
Yeah, tell us about your wound. You just had an operation on your arm.
Yeah, we've just bought a new house, and I needed to move with a lot of help, I needed to move a piano out of a sunken living room. And in the process of doing my part of this, I all but detached my bicep tendon.
Man, oh man. So this is one of those things.
Ruptured tendon, they repaired it 2 days ago.
Yeah. So you're a little bit groggy, but you're with us.
I think so.
This is one of those things, when you're young, you never think about any of this stuff. You take your physical abilities for granted, and then as we grow older, we discover that, well, they're not granted anymore. They've been taken back.
Well, you still take them for granted, but then you start discovering that you probably shouldn't.
Right, that's right. They've been returned. Well, today is my day for the subject of the day, and I want to talk about totalitarianism. So some folks out in the listening audience know that I've got several books in the works, and to just make my life that much more complicated, I've committed to writing a fourth book. So I've got 4 books in the works.
Excuse me, Chris, if I may interrupt.
I know what you're going to ask. I knew that was the question you were going to ask, and the answer is yes, it is.
Okay, good. Yeah, you hear that? Because I've been getting questions on that all the time, and every time you announce a new book.
Well, I want you to know that I did my part. I sent in the manuscript, and it was sent back to me with yet another set of revisions that they want me to make. So I thought I was done, but I'm not done. I've got some more work to do on that book. And they're good. They're good suggestions. And this is one of the things that maybe people out there in the sort of listening audience aren't aware of. When you're writing for a commercial publisher who actually expects to make money from what you write, they really have a right to say that they want things done a different way or their own way or whatever. And then you have to kind of work with them, and sort of sometimes come to an agreement about, I'll give you this if you give me that kind of thing. But anyway, that's where that stands. So that's one of the books. The other books are, I'm working on a children's picture book, and I hope to have that done in the next year, primarily because I'd love to have it ready for my granddaughters in about a year or two, so that when it comes time for them to actually, look at books on their own, they've got that book as one of the choices. So that there's that. Then I'm working on a commentary on the Book of Acts, and that's a fairly major endeavor that's going to take some time, probably 2 to 3 years to finish. So in the meantime, I thought about something. I proposed something to the folks at Canon Press. I suggested a particular way of going about it. They got really excited about it, and they sent me a contract on a spur of the moment and a number of other incentives to get me working on it, and they want it done by February 1st. So I'm kind of under the gun to get this book done. But the title of the book is How to Defeat Communism in Your Spare Time, which is one of those titles that grabs you, and that's the idea. And I'm using the word or the term communism in the title as a proxy for totalitarianism. I think the term communism stirs the blood more than totalitarianism does, but I'm going to address the larger question of totalitarianism in the book. And what got me thinking along these lines is the book that I read recently, The Psychology of Totalitarianism by Matthias Desmet, which is a really good book, and I heartily recommend it. And at the moment, I'm and revisiting Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. I don't know if you're familiar with that book, guys, but Eric Hoffer was a fascinating character, and The True Believer addresses some of the same themes that Desmet addresses. And then, of course, the classic in the genre is Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. I've noticed here that publishers like red and black when they talk about totalitarianism. But anyway, so maybe it's supposed to bring something to mind. But what I want to do is talk about something that the various authors I have consulted on the subject all agree on, and that is that totalitarianism is a modern phenomenon, and it's the conditions for the sort of the emergence of totalitarianism are fairly common in each case. In other words, there are things that have to be sort of going on socially and intellectually for totalitarianism to emerge. So it's a good thing, I think, to kind of get this conversation rolling by contrasting totalitarianism with maybe things that people confuse it with. And one of the things that people confuse totalitarianism with is authoritarianism. So an authoritarian leader, a tyrannical leader, is something we've had for examples of for time out of mind. I mean, this we can look in the Bible and identify that type of person, like in Herod the Great or so forth. And you're like, well, what's new to that? Well, totalitarianism is not that. Totalitarianism is more total in its ambit and reach. Now, the thing that you see with authoritarian leaders, tyrannical leaders, is so long as you mind your own business and leave the driving to the authoritarian leader, he's more than happy to leave you alone. Totalitarian regimes are not, cut from that cloth. Totalitarian regimes mess with your personal life. They mess with the inner space in your head. They mess with your family sort of dynamics. They're engaged in every element of the social fabric or every thread of the social fabric in a society. That's why they're totalitarian. They have the total, sort of picture in mind, and they seek to exercise control over every feature of social life and intellectual life and so forth. So anyway, that's an important contrast to make. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I am not entirely sure I would go quite as far as saying that they're different things. I think the key difference is that in the past, authoritarians didn't have the tools to be totalitarians. I think they wanted that. I think that's what they were trying to do, but they didn't have the requisite technologies and things like that to actually make it stick.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Glenn.
I think the impulse is the same in both cases.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to what you just said, and that's getting to what these writers on totalitarianism are also saying, is that the conditions, the social conditions, have to be right, and until the modern era, they've just not been right for this kind of thing to emerge. Any thoughts, Tom?
Yeah, I think this is a really important place at which the concerns of figures like Eliul and others, when they talk about the way in which the advances of science and technology can play into this dark dimension, and get when it is coupled with these kinds of dispositions, can lead to some of the most life-denying, life-threatening, and human person threatening movements, I think, ever known.
Right. Yeah, particularly Eliul's work on technology and technique. What was the book that he wrote, published on that subject? Was it The Technological Imperative or something? I can't remember the title.
One, The Technological Age. I'm trying to think of one on technocracy. They all kind of run together in my head, but I can check by year. Yeah,
please do. Well, what I want to get into is a set of things, three sort of large categories that I think address or reflect the concerns of these critics of totalitarianism, or people who are at least trying to understand it. People, as I mentioned, like Eric Hoffer and Hannah Arendt and so forth. Did you find that, by the way?
Yeah,
Tom?
he has, one of them, of course, is the Technological Society.
That's it.
And then there were a few variations. The technological system. He had a few, and the one on propaganda, I think, was significant.
Yeah, they all play into that. Well, what I want to do is just take a look at each of these categories, and then we can spend some time reflecting on just how and why developments in each of these areas provides a sort of fertile ground for the emergence of totalitarianism. So the first is a loss of a conviction or a loss of commitment to the notion that there is such a thing as human nature. So, historically, there has been a sense that people in the West have had that human beings share a common nature, no matter what time period they find themselves in. If you're living during the Renaissance, or you're living in the Assyrian Empire, a human being is a human being. And no matter what sort of social environment you find yourself in, there are certain things that still are the case when it comes to being a human being. And it's this kind of stable core that provides a basis for actually the exercise of common sense. In other words, there's a sense that human beings have that they share in common about how to sort of understand the world, discern, the difference between right and wrong, and so forth. Now, there obviously are differences that you find in different cultures, but those differences don't alter the sort of the fundamental core reality that we refer to as human nature. So there is something essential to human beings that is ahistorical. It's by virtue of their natures, or our nature, that these things are true of us because we're human beings. That has been called into question by many thinkers. We've talked about historicism. We've talked about developments in the history of Western philosophy, with people who have stressed becoming over being, the Hegelians and so forth. But what that does is that makes it sort of introduces the prospect that human beings can be fundamentally altered. And the question then is well, who's going to do the altering, and what should they be sort of engineered into becoming next? If something maybe is less than sort of desirable in the current state of affairs. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, and there tends to be coupled with that a world in which there is a loss of any kind of transcendent good towards which our natures are moving. So what happens is there becomes a substitute for that, the higher good of our future evolution, a higher sense of justice, so that everyone in this meaningless universe can at least have some space to enact their, what creatureliness they have, any of these things. So that replaced telos or goal becomes the ground and justification for the alteration. And that's another aspect. So you lose kind of, final causality, or that there is some sort of ultimate purpose and series of purposes to the human being, and then the loss of any inherent nature aimed towards those. So now it has to be almost forced or directed through manipulation rather than love.
Yeah. So the combination of the plasticity of human beings, that in the sense that we can be altered at a very sort of basic level, combined with some kind of abstract notion of what would be just or right or good. This gets us into the subject of not idolatry, but ideologies. But I can see you want to say something there, Glenn.
No, idolatry works too.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because what happens inevitably is we've got a Nietzschean will to power here, in a sense. Whether it's Hitler promoting the Aryan race as the supreme good, or the communist promoting the revolution of the proletariat and the creation of the final utopian state. Actually, in both cases, it's utopian. But you are creating arbitrarily, in a very real way, a summum bonum, and highest good. And thus, everything in the state needs to be geared toward that end, which means that these infinitely malleable people you have to be turned into the new socialist men,
Right. Yeah.
or the SS, the Aryan soldier, or something. So the two of them are connected, but I think you have to note, well, as you said, the role of ideology or even idolatry in creating the cause. Because without the cause, without something higher than the good of the supreme leader, you're never going to get the general public.
Yeah, the general buy-in that you need to have. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we have then is this matter of sort of a crisis of meaning, because there is no intrinsic nature to human beings, but also a crisis of knowledge. So in the classical outlook, because human beings possess human nature, or that's constitutive of their being as human beings, is this nature that they possess, there is some basis that we all have that we can refer to speak to each other, to work our disagreements out, to collaborate with each other as we pursue our common interests and so forth, and a kind of sense that we possess in common that would allow us to judge whether or not something is worth living for or submitting to in terms of a proposed law or what have you. Because all of that has been vacated or sort of taken off the table, that means that that others who do possess this vision, this ideological vision, and maybe knowledge concerning how to implement it, can act upon us, and we don't have any real basis to resist. The only reason why anyone would resist and say this way of looking at things is because a person has a false consciousness, maybe is sort of living out an earlier ideological sort of vision. Because basically in this way of thinking, if this is the case, if human beings are malleable to the degree that this particular outlook claims, then everything is kind of an ideological sort of product. There is no, even the notion that there is a human nature is a kind of a product of an ideology in this way of thinking, and consequently, you're just sort of living by an older, less adequate, sort of system of thought, and not really actually exercising your faculties as a human being as they are an expression of your nature. I've kind of rambled on there a bit, but I think you guys get the gist of what I'm saying. So this also means that there's just kind of a forthright embrace of power in the servants of ideology. And anybody who resists the current sort of developments with regard to this ideological vision that's being pursued by a totalitarian state is just subject to an earlier, as I noted, sort of ideology that it was also instituted just through the exercise of power.
Yeah, and the people who are dissenters are labeled reactionaries,
right,
or possibly counter-revolutionaries. And here's the thing: in all cases, as I said, totalitarian systems tend to be utopian. And the converse is also true. All utopias are totalitarian. Because the one thing you can't tolerate is dissent. Dissent threatens the coming utopia. So the way the ideologies develop, they develop very, I would argue, even self-consciously in this way, that any opposition to it is not being on the right side of history. It is working to actually produce positive harm to society by preventing us from reaching this ideal state that we're aiming toward.
Right.
Which makes you a class enemy, which makes you a traitor, which makes you any number of things which get you killed.
Yeah, and that's usually the solution. Some kind of death, maybe sort of social death in the most benign, sort of expressions. You're no longer able to access, social media platforms. You're kind of socially dead. Your livelihood is removed from you. You're fired. That kind of thing. So, but in the more sort of forthright and honest expressions, you're just killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think an important point, because I think sometimes people get confused when we use the term ideology, because a lot of times they think ideas, concepts, and so you could think of any worldview, and even the whole terminology of worldview, Weltanschauung, somewhat grows out of ideology and idealism, and so without going through that whole history, what has to be in place in these kind of movements, when we talk about idealism, is the way in which a conceptual vision is not grounded in reality and universals, but it comes from somewhere else. Either, like you both mentioned, these kind of ideals that get projected on the reality. But a lot of these movements were post-Darwinian. And so their kind of realism was what they thought of as basically everything's matter, and that concepts are nothing more than the outworking of material conditions. So this was how they sort of held their ideals, as if they were sort of realists, grounded in reality. But they're not grounded in reality in the sense that they reflect the real world. They're grounded in the fact that they're the byproduct, the accidental byproduct of the material, irrational world with no real natures. And so what you have in a lot of these visions is that there are forms of social consciousness that are not evolved enough. And so they reflect a lot of things that privilege one group over the other. And so that these, ideologues view a sort of equilibrium as the end result of this process. They want to help it along. And so they want to play with ideas and set forth an ideal that they think is connected to the material accidental conditions moving towards this equilibrium that they call justice. So it's a tricky kind of thing, but it is for most of these visions, it isn't grounded in the real as rational, like say Aquinas, where being and the law of non-contradiction are two sides of the same coin. Here, the law of non-contradiction would just be the byproduct of natural forces and consciousness, not oriented towards anything rational.
Yeah, I think that sometimes well-meaning people confuse the terms philosophy and ideology, assuming that they're referring to the same thing, that they're synonyms. While it is true that every ideology has a philosophical basis, there are philosophies that are not ideological in character. And that's hard for some people to sort of get a hold of. But ideology depends upon, first and foremost, this idea that we live in a sort of mechanistic universe, that this is just matter in motion, and that our knowledge is kind of sort of contained in our skulls, and it's the models that we make in our heads about sort of the world outside our heads that is what constitutes knowledge. Whereas in the older understanding, knowledge is what orders the world, and it can be discerned in the order of things, and your even the capacity to know is in some sense tied into this larger reality. What's happened in the modern era is this radical subjective inward turn. We go from God saying, when he's asked, who are you? I am that I am, to Descartes, I think, therefore I am. So we're grounding knowledge now in this sort of the psychology of the knower, rather than in the world outside the head.
Yeah, I have to put my obligatory comment about Descartes. That was the effect of Descartes, but that was not the intention.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
Descartes was actually trying to answer the problem of radical skepticism. And he was asking the question, okay, what is there that I can't doubt? The Pyrrhonical skeptics out there were basically saying you can't get any kind of certainty because you can doubt pretty much everything. And so without certainty, it changes your whole way of looking at knowledge. So Descartes was asking himself the question, what is it that I can't doubt? And the answer was, I can't doubt that I can doubt. And that's where the whole thing begins. But where it goes from there is a different matter.
Yeah, there's a thing in the history of the world called the law of unintended consequences.
The only universal law in history.
Yeah. And maybe another way of putting it, I mean, you don't want to, keep pounding on philosophers, but I do think someone like Kant is worth bringing up, because what you had prior to that, and of course Kant was influenced by Hume and Descartes, and tried to solve a puzzle they both, put together. But one of the things that really Kant brings to a concentration, and it's good to just think in terms of theology. Classically, theology argued from, there were debates between kind of the kind of the Platonic line and the Aristotelian line, and different ways of combining them. But classically, a lot of theology argued that we can speak metaphysically about God, both philosophically and then perfected in theology. But what happened with Kant is basically said there is no way through experience, grounded in reality, we can really take our concepts and apply them to God, because these concepts are not grounded out there in reality to which we conform. They are here. The categories are in our the structures of our consciousness. These are transcendental, but they are not transcendent. And so what do we do? Well, he said, we can't argue from experience to God, but what we can do is say we can make sense of something else in the world. We can make sense of our moral experience if we presuppose the concept God. You see what's going on here? God becomes an idea that grounds the intelligibility of my moral life. This is sometimes my criticism of certain kinds of presupposition, is that God becomes a functional idea that gives intelligibility to the worldview, rather than God being the primal reality and everything else being dependent on God. So, I think that's where you start to see theology start to become an ideology in a very clear-cut case. God becomes a function of a conceptual ground for the intelligibility of my moral experience, rather than actually the content from which a realist interpretation of creation and life and reality takes place.
So we have, with regard to this matter, human nature, kind of a ontological and an epistemological set of consequences that follow when we lose a way of speaking about human beings as having natures and being stable in some sense. That's not enough, though, for a totalitarian regime to emerge, but it is one of the preconditions in order for it to come about. Another important precondition is the breakdown of other institutions in society, something sometimes referred to as atomization. So when you have social classes, for example, there's an entire chapter in Hannah Arendt's book on the classless society and how the classless society is actually a precondition for the emergence of a totalitarian regime. When you have
I've just got a comment. As I look at a lot of American society today, it seems to me to be pretty classless. So
depends what we mean by class.
Sure, both probably are part of it,
right? But what Arendt was saying is that when you have a society that's divided into classes, you have interests. Each class has an interest, and it pursues its interest, but it can't do so without taking other classes into consideration. There is a kind of total picture in which each of the classes depends upon the others, but the classes, do have their interests. Things can get out of balance. Sometimes some classes pursue their interest at too great an expense for the others to flourish. But nevertheless, you have this sort of situation in which you've got internal divisions. Now, you can think about this in another way. You can think about, say, Kuyperian sphere sovereignty, and in which you have different spheres of authority, institutional authority in a society. One of those, of course, being the household, but you have others as well. You've got government agencies, you've got, trade associations. So you've got different, unions, different economic, different organizations that are organized to pursue some economic goal or to further some trade interest. So you have all of these different communities and structures within society, and it's within those structures that people find themselves. This is the paradox. It's in a household in which you're told in a variety of ways that you're not the center of the universe. That there are other people in the household that you need to be connected to in a positive way. There are authorities in the household that you need to submit to, and so forth. It's in households that you learn that I'm a son or a daughter or a father or a mother or a sister or a brother or an aunt or an uncle. And each of these names or titles has some responsibilities that go with those titles, and some privileges that go with those titles. Anyway, and the same is true with every other institution in the society. Now, within the modern era, with the rise of the industrial age and the development of the Industrial Revolution, many of these historic sort of ways of sort of understanding yourself begin to break down, and people become more fluid. They move from one thing to another. They move to new communities where they don't know anyone. They go to work for large bureaucratic institutions where they're just a cog in a large machine or a number on a sheet. And it's within that sort of larger society that you develop what is known as the mass or the masses. And it's when you have masses that the totalitarian is kind of coming into his own, because it's in that environment that the totalitarian state can propose a new structure that puts people to work and gives them some larger sense of meaning, a place to know who they are and who other people are, and more or less creates ex nihilo from this sort of just chaotic soup, this primordial sea, a new civilization or a new social structure. So anyway, that's what happens. You have all of these individuals who are looking for direction. They have needs, psychological and economic needs, and it's the totalitarian movement that provides those, or addresses those needs for those people. Any thoughts on that?
I think one of the things is, another way of talking about it is, the gift of form and the way in which, there are natures and arrangements of natures and hierarchies of relationships that are part of the gift. Genesis speaks about them. You look at things like the Tower of Babel, when people tried to make that hierarchy and that arrangement their own way. And one of the interesting things there, the judgment on them, is that they were going to make their own name great, rather than their name being great by God's calling them to be a family and the multitude of children that grow out of this God-centered covenant that will bless all the nations. So what you have with the Industrial Revolution, of course, is the way in which technology is such that it's beginning to develop, if you will, in a sense, where it can go the direction of Babel. And in many cases it has. With all of its blessings, it has also brought these dimensions that have impacted the core social arrangements that are central to our life. In one sense, Christianity has this element of conversion, and that can call you sometimes to uproot from your natural bonds, and if the others aren't part of that covenant, but it has you set the stage to reorient those things, not to cut yourself off of them. So you become a family grounded in Christ and a covenant, part of this family of God. But what's going on here is that it rips people up now from their natural bonds, their roots, oftentimes their churches, their denominations. Someone will move to, you look at the way in which people left Europe and came to the U.S. and started to take on the popular forms of religion. But then you get to this place where a lot of people are today, where they basically, their identities are such that, for example, their political ideas can keep them from their natural bonds of their family to where they won't even eat dinner with them. So you have this kind of cocktail in place of masses that don't have those strong forms of relationship and connectedness. And you see it, of course, with identity as well. Identity, which, this is why so many people are in therapy, because those forms have been played with and altered so much, they become so fluid that they have no reference point. And so they bear the hell of having to try to develop an identity when this was formerly something given to them with the gifts of creation.
Yeah, I think I remember Sartre saying something like, "We're condemned to be free."
Yes,
and he was getting at this very thing. In the past, there was a great deal for granted that had been granted that was understood to be obligatory, but also these were gifts. So to be a son or to be a father was just in the nature of things. It wasn't something I chose. Yeah. Now, it's still in the nature of things, but we're under the illusion that we choose these things, or that anyone can choose these things, regardless of whether or not they're biologically male, or not. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of is sort of the thing that naturally follows from this. But so we have this.
Chris,
go ahead.
If I could throw in one other direction on this, you have to have, in order for a totalitarian movement to have any kind of success, you have to have a widespread discontent in the society. And that can be caused by any number of things. Economic, defeat in war, fill in the blank. There are any number of things that can cause this. But at the same time, you don't get revolutions unless conditions are improving.
Yeah.
In other words, people who are actually at the bottom never do revolts. They're never the ones who revolt. It's the people who are rising through the ranks that are always the ones that call for revolution. They're always the ones that lead revolutions. So revolutions, to put it differently, revolutions are always done effectively by elites or by aspiring elites, never by the masses per se.
Yeah, that's the weird thing about it. The person who's particularly good at exploring this very thing is Eric Hoffer in The True Believer. Eric Hoffer was a fascinating character. I think we've talked about him once before, but he was a longshoreman in San Francisco, spoke with a thick German accent, claimed to have been born in the United States, just so happened to emerge on the American scene, right after World War II. So you're like, something doesn't add up here. But anyway, but he had just such remarkable insight into sort of these dynamics that we're just talking about, and he made that same observation. But I guess the thing that you still need when you have the sort of no longer, or I should say, you no longer have a sense that there is such a thing as a human nature, and people are malleable, and we live in a mechanistic universe, and we have people whose commitments are no longer strong, or connections are no longer strong, and they've been atomized and subject to large social forces that are already shifting and moving them around. There's still, for a totalitarian movement to develop, there has to be something that some people have referred to as mass formation. This is a term that has come back into public awareness related to things that were occurring during the pandemic. People were behaving oddly. And this drove some thinkers, including this guy, Matthias Desmet, back to the sources, and he said, I can see what's going on here. This looks like the sort of stuff that's referred to as mass formation. Now, mass formation is basically what we've been talking about. You've got this sort of formless mass filled with anxiety, dread, and in need of direction. And there are people who come along and say, I've got the direction for you. This is what we're going to do is we're going to form this mass into a movement to pursue a particular vision of the good that may be absolutely horrendous, in fact, with regard to the Nazis, or maybe appears to be a little more benign in the case of communism, but still in terms of its working out is just inhuman. But this is what we're going to do. We're going to form the masses. And there are certain things that go into the formation of the masses, and you've already brought up one of them, Tom, and that's propaganda. Being able to get your message out. And when it comes to propaganda, if you no longer have the traditional sources of authority, meaning tradition or the transcendent source of all authority, God, or even a tradition or a philosophy that points you, sort of takes you outside of yourself into some objective realm of universals, where do you turn? Well, the science. Mm-hmm. Get this, the science. Mm-hmm. You have to turn to the science, because if the universe is strictly understood as as being a machine, science is the means by which we understand the way the machine works. And there's often a very subtle sort of move that occurs in the name of science from description to prescription.
Yeah.
This is where the question begging comes along. So suddenly you go from a situation where you have, say, climate scientists describing global warming or climate change to making proposals to address this as the sort of the existential threat to the human race.
This is where, to use old terminology, natural philosophy, which was the old name for science, shifts to natural religion. This is exactly where that happens, and you even see this with notions like natural selection. Chesterton caught into this. This is why he was ridiculing some of the language in Ethics of Elfland, where he was talking about the way basically they make this little shift to teleology, that there is some kind of purpose in this material realm, and we can start prescribing things.
Yeah. So, like getting back to the climate science, you ask a climate scientist, particularly someone who believes that the Earth has been around for millions and billions of years, has there been climate change in the past? And they say, oh, yeah. We've had hot periods. We've had really cold periods. It changes all the time. And then you're like, okay, so now we have some climate change. Yes, we have climate change. And you're telling me that this is like a new development, or that there's something that, sort of about this particular situation that requires some kind of global response? Yes, of course. But then the shift has occurred. The shift has gone from, we've gone from describing to prescribing. This is why we need to go to electric cars. This is why we need renewable sources of energy, et cetera, et cetera. You get my drift.
Yeah, in the justification is, like you just said, the science. When the science is there to at its honest end, to describe in a very limited way in which future science will either confirm or negate. It's then left there to people that are moral philosophers, theologians, and related to make sense of that, not for a kind of elite hierarchy to do it. That's something classically to be debated, the way all philosophy and ethical dilemmas are. And this is exactly where the authority side, at least the psychology of the authority, plays into the kind of social consciousness.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this that I find really fascinating is we've got this cult of experts that has really developed. But when you take a look at the experts, look at the results of what they've done, it raises real questions of why we trust experts to begin with.
Yeah.
Quantitative easing. We're going to create, since the Biden administration came in, 80% of the dollars that are in circulation have been created out of nothing. And they are bewildered about why there's inflation.
Yeah.
Right.
So the solution is to change the language, right?
Yeah. So, it's, you can give example after example after example of where the experts have screwed things up royally. Yeah. Why do we trust them to the degree that we do? Why do we let them dictate policy?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of reasons. One is that we don't really believe that there's an alternative, because we no longer believe in human nature, or sort of a human telos, or a objective sort of realm of goods that we can refer to. All we have are the experts who are authorities in gathering data and analyzing it. And so their solution to every problem is more control. So the reason why this failed, Glenn, is not because we had it wrong. It's because we did not control enough of the sort of the situation on the ground. And if you want to get better results, Glenn, you got to give us more power, more authority. This is how this kind of creeping totalitarianism develops, at least in the technocratic sense that I think is our own challenge.
Has anybody kept track of the number of times that we've had 5 years to act, or climate apocalypse occurs? Right. I remember reading something like by 2020, New York City is going to be underwater unless we act dramatically right now.
Yeah.
Excuse me. How often do they have to be wrong before you start questioning it?
Yeah.
Well, it must have been the rock and roll in the 70s that heated up the planet from the Ice Age that was supposed to happen.
Right.
Real quick point, Karl Popper, no Christian that I'm aware of, but he was very suspicious of these radical moves in scientism, and he was somebody, of course, wanted to drive it towards a very realist interpretation and recognize the good of science within its limits. And one of the things he was talking about, especially these radical movements, like you see with the transgender in the surgery stuff, is he was saying that is the worst way to carry science out. First of all, because you cannot control the outcomes when you go at things with that kind of throttle. like you were just saying. You can't, and you create so much spin-off that your whole claim to want to guide, direct, and have control of things runs beyond you. So it's almost this idolatrous aim to control makes them become so zealous to run with things at such full throttle that they end up creating continuously worse situations. And this is what Glenn's point, to where your expertise just isn't expert anymore.
Yeah, which brings it back to this notion of human, this place that I began, human nature and its reality. If we have natures, if we have a nature that makes us what we are, then we have some basis for independent judgment, and we can evaluate the performance and claims of the experts. But if we don't have that, then all we can sort of left, or all that we're left with, is maybe a different set of experts who maybe prefer our point of view.
Yeah.
And you end up with a situation in which there's very little prospect for accountability when it comes to these programs, endeavors. In fact, if you raise questions, it in the minds of many people it just demonstrates your moral debauchery, or the fact that you're not morally upright. To even call into question these things demonstrates that you're somehow debased.
It's interesting because it's a very flip side of classical Western philosophy and theology. It actually requires the right kind of conversion and the right kind of spiritual, moral, and aesthetic in order to actually properly attune yourself to the reality that is there. And they automatically think through science. They have immediate access to the way things are, which is basically raw material that you can manipulate and they can direct based on their humanistic goals. Where it's actually the reverse side. They don't, even with their scientific techniques, have a proper insight into the nature of things apart from a rigorous kind of moral and spiritual humility that is required to actually submit, if you will, your mind to the being that is really there and hear the directions that it points, which, of course, theology fills in the fullest sense.
Now, some of our listeners might be wondering, just how was science employed in, say, the Nazi regime or in the Soviet regimes? Well, there was Soviet science. There was Nazi science. They had a set of presuppositions, you could say, that we would reject, but within the framework of those presuppositions, you could make a kind of sense out of what they proposed. With the Nazis, of course, it was racial superiority that they wanted to preserve and promote. And so there was a kind of science, eugenics, that had the task of demonstrating the superiority of the Aryan race and further developing it and purifying it. So you had some of the stuff that we see going on today with regard to genetic projects, in place in the Nazi, totalitarian state. Within the Soviet Union, you had a framework which presented itself as scientific in character, and that's dialectical materialism. So the premise of dialectical materialism is one that you brought out earlier, Tom, and that is that matter seeks a kind of equilibrium, and because human economics, as they are currently practiced in a capitalist society, don't have the kind of equilibrium that they ought to have if they've reflected the natural order of things. There is a kind of inevitable progress that will sort of be carried out, which will bring about an equality of conditions for everyone in a society. And so that was the scientific, quote, scientific premise that informed communism. So there's an appeal to the science in both of those places. Now,
the other thing is that, well, I suppose it's not really odd. Their presuppositions determined the things that were acceptable within the framework. So, for example, I remember running into a number of people who had read Soviet history, scientific history, in which they talked about what they called totalitarian agriculturalists, as opposed to the free nomadic herding peoples who didn't own any property or anything like that. It's the evil agrarians were the problem. If you actually look at ancient history, the agricultural societies were constantly being attacked and invaded by the pastoralists. They were the ones who were the aggressors constantly. Every major defensive wall, fortification system in the ancient world was put up to separate agricultural territories from pastoral territories, starting with the Great Wall of China. And yet, by Soviet, because of the assumption that private property is evil and is the source of, we're going back to Rousseau, private property is evil and is the source of all problems in society, because of that assumption, they have to go with the agriculturalists as being the bad guys in the story.
And this, I think, reflects a significant problem with this kind of scientism that we see. You can't really challenge it. You can't call it into question, because to do so undermines the entire ideological program. You go from being, say, a set of people who are really interested in understanding the truth of things and how to address, the circumstances you find yourself in well, to people who are just trying to defend the status quo with regard to the, intellectual institutions that people belong to. And anyone who dares to call into question the science is a heretic and has to be punished, exiled. You get the point. But we saw that with COVID, and we're now seeing it, and we have been seeing it with the climate stuff. Anybody who says, there may be something that we are overlooking here, or this isn't really taking this into account, that person is now persona non grata.
Yeah. Well, that's how they, that's how their aim. They aren't, liberal in the positive sense of the word, that they're interested in exchanging ideas to get a hold of truth, to making argument. What they're interested in is having their vision center and absolute. And then anything that is a challenge to it is a threat, because it isn't grounded in reality. It's something that needs to be held in power. And so, it has to control any kind of opposition. One of the best ways to do it is turn any questioner into having an evil motive, right? So the person who may think that dealing with things in a way that just promotes another kind of racism or other kinds is therefore a white supremacist trying to protect their own privileges and this, that, and the other, or a patriarchal, person who wants to just dominate everyone else. These pejoratives start to take on psychological effect to shut and silence, cancel, and eliminate any. And you see, there's a whole list. They don't even argue for it. They're a misogynist, homophobe, And so if they can just make that list, that can just shut someone out. Of course, it has a lot to do with people not really getting to the point of all or nothing. But that's one of the mechanisms. I think with technology, you're seeing it even louder. And then the connection of banks, especially, and who knows with the IRS, to basically go after any kind of group or person who opposes certain, directions and ideas.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to sort of draw this to a conclusion, because I think that often when we think about totalitarian states, we have people like Hitler or Stalin or Pol Pot or Mao come to mind, and we say, well, who's that person in our situation? We don't have anyone like that. Maybe some people would like to insert Trump, although maybe he's got some megalomaniac, characteristics, but he certainly doesn't have the control of the elite institutions that you would need to control in order to actually pull this thing off in the way that Stalin and Hitler did, and Mao. But I think that something even more, I guess, insidious and I think frightening is developing in our society, and that is a kind of mass mind that has the wherewithal to almost be leaderless in a certain sense, where the ideology becomes just so pervasive and so intrinsically kind of wrapped up in the institutions of authority in our society that no one really needs to coordinate anything. Everything is just sort of done on the fly in a kind of technocratic nightmare.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that you're seeing it promoted is sort of the secular religious calendar, if you will. This week is devoted to this group. This week is to Pride. This month is for this. This is a constant cycle, symbols everywhere that are ingraining within us in the psychology of a people. What old religious calendars used to do for the faithful, right? Create unity of consciousness, create a shared religious vision. That's just one angle of it, but you have these, you see this stuff, and even to the point where I've seen some kind of otherwise left-wing people in Britain during the whole Pride thing with this. I mean, the whole neighborhood, basically set up in these rainbow symbols, saying this is just getting creepy, But what is driving this, and who is driving this, and why do you have this shared institutional mindset flooding through just about everything?
One other thing that is worth noting here: in none of these mass movements that we've been talking about, in none of them that I'm aware of did the majority of people actually buy into it. The majority of people went along with it.
Yeah,
they didn't necessarily buy into it. And that's something that I think is important for us to keep in mind now, because we're in a situation where I think a lot of people are just keeping their heads down and keeping their mouths shut because they don't want to get canceled, because they don't want to lose their jobs or lose their reputation or lose their friends or whatever. And yet it is those people being quiet that actually enables the totalitarian to take over, even if they don't support him.
Yeah. Right. Or the totalitarian system. Maybe the new Mao is AI. Because what we have, that's the sort of the feature that's been added, is this sort of media ecology. There's this sort of social media environment that makes it possible to ostracize someone almost instantaneously everywhere online. And I think you're right, Glenn. Now, the question is what to do. And I think that the answer is we have to have people who just won't shut up. And this is what dissidents do. Matthias Desmet, in his book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, really zeroes in on this. And he says, you got to have just a lot of dissidents who just won't shut up in order to keep the worst from happening. And when the worst does happen, they just need to keep talking. And that requires, of course, courage and a willingness to pay the price. And very few people have what it takes to sort of just stand on their own and do these things. You also need communities that provide a place for these people to live and find friendship and support. So, our churches need to be like that. Unfortunately, some of the churches fail miserably in this respect. In fact, they kind of baptize the totalitarian system. We have examples in Nazi Germany. We have examples in China and in
the
former Soviet
evangelical
Union.
church in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of people that I just look at in the big evil world and I say, man, I don't trust you to look after my interests or tell the truth at all. There is nothing that you've done that demonstrates an ability to go against the flow when it comes to these matters. You just get carried right along with the rest of the folks. You even parrot the same talking points.
Well, this is what you get with formless Christianity. Once the incarnational form doesn't have a religious form, relationship without religion, you basically, transcendence has been removed from being immanent in form and so what do you have? A vacuum, and it's the same shape as everything else, and so it's as fluid and easy to manipulate as anything else, because it's almost purely a psychological relationship to God. Therefore, it's very manipulatable.
Yeah. Anyway, well, let's wrap things up here. I'm going to be working on this book for a while. I'll be returning to themes related to this matter in the weeks and months ahead. So we don't need to get it all figured out right now. Well, we thank you for listening to another episode of the Theology Pugcast. We're very pleased by the number of people who've become patrons, who are giving on a monthly basis to the show. Thank you very much, folks who've done that. We've got some assassins out there, people who give at $100 a month. And then there are grumblers and super grumblers, and we're grateful for all the grumbling that goes on in our Patreon world. We're also grateful for the folks who listen to us on the Fight, Laugh, Feast network and support us there. We were just going over the numbers today, and definitely half of our listeners are in that world. And we're grateful to the Fight, Laugh, Feast people for providing a platform for our show. And we're even more grateful for the people who give to us through the Fight, Laugh, Feast network on a regular basis. So thanks, one and all, for your support, your prayers, for sharing the show with folks. We're pretty confident that we have an audience of about 10,000 pugsters out there. It just blows our minds. But all the data that we get seems to indicate that's the case. And anyway, with all those things said, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.